This is the America's Quarterly Podcast. I'm Brian Winter. Cuba is facing an unprecedented crisis with economic turmoil, a massive exodus of people, and a hostile administration in the White House. On today's episode, we'll explore the stability of the Cuban dictatorship and what life is currently like for most people on the island.
When Raul Castro is no longer in the scene, I think it will be more significant in a lot of ways than when Fidel Castro died, because Fidel Castro was very ill. He had been out of power. He was no longer really running Cuba at all. Raul Castro is very much involved, and he is the bridge between the civilian leadership and the military, which in many ways runs more of the economy than the civilian leadership.
In the 66 years since the Cuban Revolution, we've arguably never seen the country in as deep a crisis as this one. The Cuban economy never really recovered after the COVID pandemic, and the dictatorship of Miguel Diaz-Canel continues to suffocate most attempts at private business or entrepreneurship. The country has experienced 5 major blackouts in the last year, and allies like Venezuela and Russia are not coming to the rescue in the same way they used to. The result has been a national exodus, with as much as 20% of the Cuban population estimated to have left the island in just the last 5 years. It all leads to the natural question of just how stable the Cuban regime really is. Now, since 1959, the dictatorship has repeatedly defied expectations of its demise and crushed any potential signs of dissent. Though it remains to be seen what will happen with Raul Castro, now at age 93, Donald Trump back in the White House, and longtime Cuba hawk Marco Rubio as Secretary of State. Today on the podcast, we'll speak to Patrick Oppmann, who has been CNN's bureau chief in Havana for 13 years. Patrick will talk to us about conditions on the ground, what life is like for everyday Cubans under these circumstances, and give us his view on politics in today's Cuba. Patrick, welcome to the AQ Podcast.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you.
Patrick, as I noted in the introduction, you've been CNN's correspondent in Havana for 13 years. What feels different about the current moment?
And I've been coming to Cuba every year, at least several times for the last 30 years. So I was here when the Soviet Union had just collapsed, and people said, nothing could be worse than that. We've essentially been, kind of abandoned to our fate. And now what people will tell you is what the Cubans are experiencing on a day-to-day basis is far worse than that. The power cuts are worse. Their salaries are essentially worthless. And in a lot of ways, it's almost crueler now that for the 1% that live on the island, and that includes myself, of course, as a CNN correspondent, there are very high-priced goods that you can get now, but those are just simply out of reach for most Cubans. So in a lot of ways, it was better after the Soviet Union collapsed. There was nothing for anybody. And now for this emerging class of small business people and other people who are connected, they're living in a lot of ways better than ever. They have generators, they can go to markets, and there's food to buy. But for the other 99%, life has never been harder here.
Our audience is an audience that knows Latin America well, but they may not follow on a day-to-day basis what's been happening in Cuba. Can you try to explain to us why things are so much worse right now than they have been?
It's really been kind of a tsunami of bad luck and bad decision. COVID had an impact on the region. Here in particular, as an island, it all but shut down. You've had the harshest sanctions put on Cuba during the first administration of Donald Trump. Those were largely left in place or added to by Joe Biden. And the current government just has not addressed the lingering problems. You have a government that has not carried out sufficient reforms, has not followed through on the reforms that they themselves said they needed. And as at the same time, the U.S. has doubled and tripled down on sanctions, which really do have an impact as well.
I want to talk about the scale of the migration that you mentioned. But before we do, let me just ask you one question about the Cuban private sector, such as it is. And we've read a lot, we've published a lot in America's Quarterly over the years about the growth of this, very fragile, very tentative, quite small private sector entrepreneurs that the Cuban government allowed to exist. What is their current status?
So people always, ask me, what's the strongest institution in Cuba? Is it the military? Is it the Communist Party? And I like to say, tongue in cheek, but not that it's the bureaucracy. And they're Cuban entrepreneurs that I followed, throughout the course of their careers. And you get an update from them. Oh, it's been a year and I got the license to open up, a small business. Oh, it's been another 6 months and I got permission to open a bank account. Oh, this is a true story, 2 years and I got permission to put a sign in front of my store. And so, for people like Cubans are, at least in my opinion, the most creative, the most resilient people on earth. And that's why they're so successful when they leave Cuba. But here they face incredible restrictions. And some of those are from the U.S. side of things that blocks them from having access to the U.S. financial system, but as well from their own government that just has a fear of people getting too big, too successful, and puts all these limitations on them. And the government is constantly not only limiting them, but a lot of times in competition with them for the services they provide. And when you see someone get too successful here, you kind of worry for them that the government will see that and decide to shut them down. And that happens all the time.
Patrick, I am far from being an expert on Cuba. I've never been to Cuba. I make a rule of not, opining on countries that I've never even set foot in. It has served me well. But, I look at this kind of push and pull and this back and forth that you described, and I have wondered over the years if the Cuban government in some ways is caught between two impulses. One of them being, they know that they need a more dynamic private sector or something like that to bring their country out of this stagnation and decline. But on the other side of it, they don't want to give up control, and they fear the emergence of an alternate power center that could ultimately take from them what they value most, which is their own power.
And control is very important here. They see themselves as this country that is besieged on all sides, that they're 90 miles away from this very powerful enemy that has stopped at nothing to end the Cuban Revolution. And that's why they need to have kind of a total control here. They're not living in the Cuba they envisioned. They thought the Soviet Union was going to win the Cold War. These are people that grew up with that mentality, that perhaps studied economics in Moscow at one point in their lives. And that's where, they're still hoping that things will swing around. We heard Raul Castro, when he was running the day-to-day of this country, talk about all the time, we need to reform, we need to allow people to have these businesses. It's remained, though, on a very small scale. And there still is this kind of ingrained resistance to giving up that control, though.
You mentioned Raul Castro. He, since 2019, he's no longer president. But what is his importance in Cuban politics today? And, how much of an event could it be when he eventually, is no longer with us?
So he's 93. He as far as we know, he looks fit. He spends more time in the part of the country where he's from, Santiago de Cuba, the second largest city. He no longer runs the day-to-day, and yet he's still the most powerful man in this country. There are divisions in the Cuban government like any other government, and Raul Castro is essentially the glue that keeps it together. And the current president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, says he goes to Raul Castro on every major decision they take. When Raul Castro is no longer in the scene, I think it will be more significant in a lot of ways than when Fidel Castro died, because Fidel Castro was very ill. He had been out of power. He was no longer really running Cuba at all. Raul Castro is very much involved, and he is the bridge between the civilian leadership and the military, which in many ways runs more of the economy than the civilian leadership. People in the government would say, well, we're still around, so we must be doing something right. But a lot of people in the government I know, their kids have left. There is a dissatisfaction that obviously that their salaries are almost worthless, and that things are not getting better, they're getting worse.
How would you describe the politics of Diaz-Canel, and have they changed at all, or have they remained pretty static?
For all of us who've been covering this for a really long time, there was this expectation that the generation that came after the Castros, that they would embrace reform. But, Raul Castro said many, many times, we're not going to allow a Gorbachev to take power in Cuba. And I think, they had a long time to find a successor, and they found someone in Miguel Diaz-Canel who's going to hold the line. And his main slogan is continuity. And interestingly enough, you heard a lot more about reforms and change under the last years of Raul Castro's leadership than in the now term and a half of Miguel Diaz-Canel. He really has just been kind of a placeholder. And while he is more modern in the sense that he talks about AI, that he talks about digitalization, that he's more of an active leader because he's a younger guy. He gets around the provinces a whole lot, but he's not offering any new ideas. And a lot of his trips, there are these kind of Potemkin villages. I've covered a few of them where he goes into a town. They put all these products in the stores. They put on the power for a day or two, and they pretend like everything's all right. And then when he leaves, all of that vanishes. And of course, as someone who's gone up through the system, he knows that that's what happens when he visits a place, that the mirage of prosperity that they're showing him isn't real. And yet that's kind of the hand he's been dealt. And, how much of the country is he really running? Is he in charge of the Cuban military and all their projects, building hotels and running so much of the tourism economy? It's not clear.
So let's talk about the relationship with the United States. It's perhaps been more static than people think. And what I mean by that is, since President Trump took office in 2017 and rolled back some of the engagement policies from the Obama years, things have been pretty steady since then. I mean, President Biden did not go back to the Obama era policies. He maintained, as you noted, what President Trump did. But now we have an administration in the White House. They've been there for almost 3 months. It is led by President Trump, who has spoken very clearly about his desire to see democracy in Cuba one day. It's also a Secretary of State in Marco Rubio, who is himself the son of Cuban migrants, who has had regime change in Cuba as a top priority for, I think you could say, his entire career. I think that's a safe thing to say. Would like nothing more than to see change in Cuba. What do you know? I mean, recognizing the challenges that you just described in terms of getting information in Cuba, how would you describe the relationship between the United States and Cuba 2 months back into a new Trump administration?
For those of us who've lived in Miami, the joke there was always that Miami was the only city in the United States with its own foreign policy. And certainly, for many, many years, the dream in Miami has been that the Berlin Wall in Cuba will collapse one day. That you'll see this is, they don't want a transition. They want a complete collapse. They want, the people who are left from the revolution to go on trial. And of course, that doesn't seem any closer today than it ever has been, except you have Marco Rubio, who's made his whole political career, which I've covered. He's based all that on getting these guys out of power and what he would say is freeing Cuba. So at the beginning of the Trump administration, the second administration, he gave a very honest and remarkable interview where he said, the only thing I have to talk to with the Cuban government is when they're going to leave. And that really seems to be the policy. And so, it's kind of a drip, drip, drip. And maybe, on a day-to-day basis, we don't always see it, but the State Department has put pressure on Caribbean countries that accept Cuban doctors, which of course are one of the lifelines of the government here, that they receive most of the money those doctors make when they go work abroad. And they're putting pressure on those governments, threatening to deny officials and their families visas to go to the United States if they hire Cuban doctors. That could have a huge impact. Paradoxically, despite the fact there's an embargo, Cuba gets most of its food from the United States. The food is produced cheaply in the U.S. It's so close, and it's one of the exceptions to the embargo. And so it wouldn't take too much more to really cause even worse economic pain here. And that seems to be the plan. And it's just this slow changing of regulations, pressuring of allies, getting Mexico to stop sending oil here, getting other countries that really do depend on the United States in that relationship, but help Cuba cut off some of that help. And so it's kind of already a feeling here that the country's on the verge of some kind of collapse, whether it's the power system or the fact that you go to banks and there's no money anymore to take out. You have to bring it in a suitcase. Most of the food is coming in suitcases or in containers. It wouldn't take much to make that situation go from bad to worse.
I want to come back to that social feeling, but before we do, I want to ask you about the relationship with two other countries. I asked about the relationship with the United States. Let me ask you about China and Russia. China being a country, there have been reports that China's surveillance activities in Cuba have increased. Russia, as you noted earlier, was historically the major partner of Cuba. Can you talk to us about both of those relationships today?
It's so interesting with China because, of course, they still are, unlike Russia, a communist country. And yet the investment around the region by China is so much greater than it is in Cuba. And when they come here, they have very frank conversations where they say, if we're going to build a hotel, we're going to do it our way with our workers. They have some symbolic investments, that there's some donations. But otherwise, considering these are two communist countries, there's strikingly little Chinese involvement and investment in Cuba. The Russians have long historic ties, but as Russian officials have told me, the problem we have with the Cubans is they're still communists and we're not. And there has been frustration because of this entrenched Cuban bureaucracy where there will be an announcement, there'll be a deal, and a year, 2 years later, nothing happens. And the Russians will say, we couldn't do this because of this reason, because of that reason, they had to change the law. And things move incredibly slow here. And that has been a frustration on the part of Russian officials. There's also the memory that one of the reasons the Soviet Union collapsed is because of the billions and billions of dollars of aid they sent to Cuba. Cubans were living better under the Soviet times than the Russians themselves were, because it was so important to Soviet foreign policy to maintain this thorn in the side off the coast of the United States. So there is still this kind of hope here that someone will come riding into the rescue, whether it'll be the Russians or the Venezuelans or the Chinese. And yet on the horizon, we just don't see that. There's no one who can foot the bill in the way that they used to here.
So it's clear that no external savior is coming to the rescue. So let's talk, Patrick, about the public mood, about the people who you see and talk to every day living there. You mentioned that there's this feeling like the country is on the verge of collapse. Some might argue that it is collapsing as we speak. I mean, given just the scale of the exodus of Cubans.
So if you go outside Havana, what people do now is they might get sort of 3 or 4 hours of power a day. And a lot of times it's in the middle of the night. So people will get up in the middle of the night. They'll do their cooking in the middle of the night. They'll do their laundry in the middle of the night. They'll get everything they need ready to send their kids off to school where there'll be no power, or maybe there'll be a generator, and themselves to go to work or not, because a lot of times people are just told not to even bother to go into work. So it's very much a surreal existence. And so for regular Cubans who are seeing this runaway inflation where their salary in pesos is worth less and less every day to the dollar, more prices, even in government stores, are in dollars. And so the only solution, because when people have gone out and protested, they've been accused of working for the United States, of getting lengthy jail sentences. People, if they can leave, they are leaving. And what that all too often means is the young, talented people this country needs. Maybe it's the engineers who know how to keep the power plants running. Maybe it's the people who are vital to keeping the economy, at least on life support, if not functioning. They're deciding to get out of here. And for the people who are really tough and remain here, they call it la lucha, that every day is just going to be a struggle. And that may mean you spend a whole day looking for milk or just dealing with the transportation problems. But that becomes your kind of existence. And people love their country. Cubans absolutely love their country. And that's why many people don't want to leave. But, already 10 to 20% of the country have decided they've had enough and thrown in the towel.
Well, and this reality that you're describing of people, leaving out of a sense of despair, wanting to make lives better, at least for their kids, that's not new in Cuba. I mean, it's gotten worse, but it's a reality that has existed in Cuba since virtually the moment of the Cuban Revolution. And we saw episodes in the past, like the Mariel boat lift and others. And I guess my question, Patrick, as we kind of approach the end here is, will that continue to be the Cuban story of just these waves of people who leave, but a regime that remains in place? Or do you see and sense the possibility of some kind of political change?
So certainly, for the United States, having a failed state this close to its shores is in no one's benefit. And imploding Cuba would lead to a crisis that we're already sort of on the verge of touching, where people are going hungry, will become more desperate. Part of the thing that makes it tougher is these are very educated people. These are people, one of the successes up until now of the revolution was that people got a pretty decent education, a lot of propaganda, but a decent education. And they can't do much with that education, but there's certainly people who are aware of the world, aware of their possibilities, and increasingly frustrated by the lack of possibilities, and that they are locked in this Cold War sense of antagonism that they have no control over, and that they have very little say in the decisions their own government makes. But something has to give here, and whether it's going to be people getting in boats, people protesting, or people just continuing to leave in a way that humans have never seen in their lifetimes, it can't continue the way it is. And yet you don't hear on either side of the Florida Straits any real solutions being offered.
Patrick, thanks so much for joining us on the AQ Podcast.
My pleasure. Great to speak with you.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly Podcast is produced and edited by Luisa Franco. Our sound engineer is Gabriela Baez.